A very good morning to a good afternoon as well, and good evening to everyone. Really thrilled to welcome all of you here today to this discussion on policies to tackle poverty and inequality in Latin America. And I'm especially delighted to see that government officials from the region have also logged on. I will start off by first introducing the excellent four panelists we have with us today. Silvana Vargas is the Minister of Development and Social Inclusion of Peru and has been at the forefront of tackling the impact of COVID-19 on social outcomes there. Nora Lustig is an internationally renowned expert on poverty and inequality in Latin America, currently a professor of Latin American economics at Tulane University and director of the Commitment to Equity Institute, and a former colleague and friend. Luis Fernando Mejia is the executive director of Fedesarroyo, which is one of Latin America's foremost think tanks. He's also former director general of the Department of Planning in the Colombian government. And our own Alejandro Werner is director of the Western Hemisphere Department here at the IMF. So I very much look forward to a vibrant discussion with our distinguished panel and warmly welcome them all. So let me highlight that this event coincides with the launch of a new paper prepared by IMF staff on commodity cycles, inequality, and poverty in Latin America. I very much hope that all of you joining this event take the opportunity to get it from our website at imf.org. Now, as we know, inequality has been on the rise around the world in recent decades, and it is becoming one of the key global policy challenges. Throughout the 20th century, Latin America was associated with some of the world's highest levels of inequality. But the story was different in the first decade and a half of the 21st century, when Latin America made important progress in reducing both poverty and inequality. But then starting around 2014, poverty and inequality gains began to slow down in the region, and in some cases, even went into reverse. And now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, it is likely to dramatically worsen poverty and inequality dynamics in the short term. And in addition to women, low-skilled and informal workers were most affected by the crisis. Unfortunately, early estimates suggest that a substantial fraction of the gains made since the early 2000s will be wiped out. For example, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean estimates 82 million people fell into poverty in 2020, bringing the poverty rate to levels not seen since the late 2000s. And estimates by our panelist, Nora Lustig, also show a potentially dramatic increase in inequality. Now, of course, I must add that the impact of COVID-19 could have been far worse had it not been for the large-scale government support rolled out in many countries in the region. So for example, in Peru, several rounds of emergency cash transfers were paid to low-income households. And I really look forward to hearing from Minister Vargas on how this program helped cushion the blow and the challenges encountered in putting it in place. Let me also say that a potential ray of opportunity might come from commodity prices, which have been which have risen substantially in recent months and can offer some respite to hard-hit commodity exporting countries. But of course, that in itself will not be a durable solution because the region's problems predate the commodity boom. And these problems include social safety nets that are weak, taxation that is insufficiently progressive, pension systems that are unequal and sometimes unsustainable, and low potential growth in many countries in the region. So it is evident that poverty and inequality are perhaps the most important challenges facing the region. region. And that's what we want to discuss today, focusing on three main questions. First, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on poverty and inequality? Second, what is the outlook going forward? And third, most importantly, what should be done to tackle poverty and inequality in the region? So let me begin by posing questions to individual panelists and then ask others to jump in if they see the need to do so. Let me ask our panelists to kindly keep your initial responses to 5 minutes so that we have plenty of time for the discussion. And Professor Lustig, I'm going to start with you, given the extensive work that you've done trying to quantify the impact of the crisis on poverty and inequality across the region. So why don't you start by telling us how severe the reversal in poverty and inequality has been in Latin America, and how effective have government interventions been at cushioning the impact? Nora, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Antoinette, for being in this distinguished panel. Thank you, Alejandro and Ravi, for inviting me, and glad to be here with such distinguished co-panelists. And I wanted to start by saying two things. First, congratulate the team that authored the excellent report. As I said in our green room before we started, I think it is laid out very interesting ideas and analysis that should be pursued further. I also want to say something about the IMF, if I may. I am so pleasantly surprised that in the last years, it's been now several years, that the IMF has decided to consider inequality and poverty part of its purview, because I have been working on social policies in the context of adjustment for many moons. And before it was not the case. It was very hard to engage the IMF in the discussion beyond what the macro policies had to be and what the macro consequences were of the different policies. So it is an immense favor to the global community that the IMF has joined the ranks of the groups that are concerned about inclusion. So I wanted to start with that. So now to your question. We've been doing work on specific countries, and I think that the first point that we need to mention is that the effect has been quite heterogeneous. So there's not one Latin America. There's different countries, and the different countries perform very differently. Why did they perform very differently? First of all, it depended on the extent to which they introduce an aggregate countercyclical macro package to face the aggregate shock. The extent to which they did this forcefully reduced the negative impact on growth, and that in itself contain the negative impacts on inequality and poverty. So macro policy is crucial, as always, in relation to inequality and poverty. Second depends on how much they spend on safety nets within those packages. So what we've seen is, I always point out, I mean, we study particularly Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. And it's interesting to make the contrast between Brazil and Mexico, which are in opposite ends, where Brazil introduced one of the largest packages in macroeconomic terms and also spent among the largest amounts on safety nets, around 4% of GDP. And Mexico introduced a very small fiscal package, if at all, and did not expand its existing safety nets. So what we've seen is that in Brazil, in fact, our estimates and also the estimates by other economists in Brazil, you have the perhaps contradictory result that in 2020, inequality and poverty appears to be lower than in 2019. So actually, it's a country in which it was reduced. Was it done well? That's a different question, but it's apparently been not only contained but reduced. In the case of Mexico, because there were no policies introduced, what we see is that it's probably the country that's going to show the largest increase in the number of absolute poor in this context. So I think that it's interesting, and here, for the IMF itself to draw lessons in terms of macro policy. And second, in terms of the specific policies, one thing that I want to note is that, for example, Brazil, Argentina, to a lesser extent, Colombia, introduced safety nets, in particular Brazil, to an extent that people couldn't dream before those policies were implemented. At the beginning of the pandemic, the concern was, will there be an ability to reach those who are in the informal sector and are not part of the cash transfer program? So they're not in administrative registries in the Social Security formal sector, and they're not either in the administrative registries of the cash transfer programs. Well, Brazil was able to reach about close to 70 million people with cash transfers in a matter of 2-3 weeks. There may be lots of errors of inclusion, maybe errors of exclusion, I'm sure, but it was able to do it. And like I said, it's something to sort of look at it more carefully and learn what is it that they did that could be replicated in other countries and also improved in terms of what errors were committed. This final point I want to make is that beyond income, you also mentioned dimensions that had to do with maybe how it's affected the differentially among different groups like gender or ethnic and racial groups. I think also the non-income dimensions are very important. And the one that we're emphasizing in our work in other types of research that we've been doing is the impact on education. School closures are going to have a lasting impact. And I think that's where all the efforts have to be put to remediate, reduce this long lasting impact going forward. According to our estimates, based on what happened to school closures in the region, we could see that the cohorts that are now in high school may, especially those who are in households with parents with low educational background, will end up with high school completion rates not seen since the 1960s. So human capital erosion, we know, is bad for growth and bad for equity. That's where we need to put the emphasis moving forward. Reversals in terms of income poverty will happen as soon as the economy starts to grow. This will not automatically reverse the erosion in human capital. So let me stop here.
Excellent, excellent, Nora, and gives us a lot of material to sink our teeth into and to situate our conversation around. And just excuse me for 1 second in trying to ask the IMF studio to mute because there's a lot of interference, I'm afraid, with the conversation we're seeking to have. If those who are in the IMF studio can please make sure it's muted. Thank you. So no, I was saying thank you very much for that intervention, Nora. Certainly, as you mentioned, countries in Latin America are quite different, and of course, every country has its own experience and its own challenges dealing with the crisis. But very, very important points you've made on macro policies, of course, and the extent of rolling out safety nets, in particular Brazil's experience, and the almost surprising impact of 2020 looking better on the poverty front than it did in 2019, with a huge rollout of fiscal support there in Brazil. And but this last point on the non-income dimensions and the importance of human capital and the detrimental impact of school closures is a hugely significant issue that the international community for sure has to work with country authorities to take forward. And it is, as you say, with so many implications, not just for inequality, but for growth as well. And so I'm sure others will want to comment on that. So it's a good segue for us to move to talking in a more focused way about country experiences. And for that, I'm going to turn to Minister Vargas and Silvana to educate us a bit more on Peru's experience in dealing with the social consequences of the pandemic and how she sees the social outcomes there in Peru what lessons we can draw from the policy response that have worked, and what lessons can we draw from what has not worked as well. So, Minister, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antoinette. That looks more like a defense type kind of question. But many thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure for us to be here. And I actually appreciate the IMF concern about discussing about the consequences the pandemic is causing on poverty and inequality in Latin America. And actually, I do believe that poverty and inequality will only be reverted as long as we actually decide to go and move beyond the line and actually invest in human development, putting people at the center, people first. 3 brief opening remarks about Peru, just along the line that was exposed at the beginning. Peru, to understand how Peru has evolved during the past decades. First, from 2004 to 2011, we experienced a remarkable 4-point poverty reduction, attributable actually to both economic growth associated, of course, to the price of commodities, just as the paper is suggesting, but also a strong social policy or social protection policy. Second, we are currently a country of over 32 million people, an estimated 10% increase in our poverty rate as a consequence of the pandemic. These estimates are still estimates, so we are about to have an official report being published in the next few weeks. And actually, currently, a third of our population is under this condition. So this is just to frame how things are actually moving. And actually, another issue that is very important to frame the Peruvian context is the pandemic has taken a toll on us, showing that probably this miracle that we were just experiencing a couple of years ago is probably not really actually getting to the roots of inequality and poverty in Peru. So probably we need to switch to a multidimensional approach to actually get to what actually well-being is, particularly among the poorest communities. So my first reflection deals with 3 aspects: actions taken, social outcomes, and lessons learned. Let me go briefly through each of these actions. We're actually trying to make our best effort to combine both the sense of urgency with a sense of opportunity. What does actually mean? That we are really working hard towards a combined strategy to face the emergency, the urgency, including monetary support through these cash transfers that were mentioned a minute ago, targeting 4.6 million very vulnerable households, food aid through the provision of food, and actually through community networking strengthening. So it's actually monetary, food aid, and community action. This community action is actually providing alerts in terms of COVID cases, particularly among the elderly and people with disabilities, to be able to face the emergency as soon as possible. However, we have not left out 2 main issues that are important for our social policy, including early childhood development by the provision of childcare, vaccines, iron supplements, because we cannot allow the pandemic to kidnap what priorities are. So this issue of combining what is important with what is an emergency, it's part of what we have learned. In terms of outcomes, I would say that recent evidence suggests that these cash transfers have actually contributed to reactivating the economy, because this money is basically used to buy food, pay loans, and pay services. So it's actually reverting to the economy, as well as alleviating in the short term some needs people are actually facing. In addition, these cash transfers have also promoted financial inclusion. We have over 400,000 people that are actually now part of our banking system, of our financial system, as a consequence of these measures. And also, we have also learned that malnutrition and anemia are showing steady rates, although these are not really good news, But in this context, actually not going back is actually maybe positive. In terms of lessons, I will go very briefly. Poverty is multidimensional in nature. It's not only about income. We need to concurrently tackle its different dimensions, meaning water, health access, education, food support, community strategies to guarantee that we are actually tackling inequality. In second place, we know that social outcomes are not only attributable to social policy. We need to start a strong dialogue with economic, labor, environmental policies in the same pattern, at the same speed. And finally, one size fits all policies, even within a country, are not showing to be effective anymore. So that means that diversity of local dynamics through a territorial approach, it's actually probably the way to go. I would stop there, Antoinette. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Minister, for that powerful intervention and quite a bit that we can take away from Peru's experience. I think in agreement in a way with Nora. I mean, you stressed the multidimensional nature of poverty and inequality and the need to address it accordingly. And that is certainly a lesson to take away and to deepen our reflections around. And it's very, very interesting to see the deepening of efforts at inclusion that one specific action for in the case of cash transfers, targeted cash transfers, can have on financial inclusion. Very very important there as well. You know, helping to achieve a number of objectives potentially. So quite a bit to take away from Peru, and we'll come back and ask you about some of what it took on the political economy side to make that response possible. But let's continue to drill down into country experiences a bit, and this is my way of turning to Luis Fernando Mejia and to ask him to speak to Colombia's experience. And of course, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, part of what is in a way not unique, but very different in the Latin American experience compared to some other country experiences and regional experiences I'm familiar with, is the very positive role that the commodity boom played in the past in helping to address poverty and inequality. And that's very different from a number of commodity producers in sub-Saharan Africa, in the central sub-Saharan African area in particular, where oil wealth has not helped to reduce poverty or inequality. Colombia, of course, as a commodity exporter, made a substantial progress in the first 15 years of the 20th century. But now with the fall in oil prices we saw in the pandemic, all of that having quite an impact in stalling that progress. So, Luis Fernando, tell us how you view the perspectives for poverty and inequality in Colombia, and what are the key challenges that the country faces to resume that path of lowering poverty and inequality coming out of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Antoinette. It's a great pleasure being in this panel. Hello to Silvana, Nora, and Alejandro as well. Well, first, before commenting on your question, I would like to congratulate the authors of this paper. I enjoyed it very much. I think it combines theory with a very sophisticated applied analysis to uncover the channels through which the commodity boom reduced poverty and inequality in commodity exporters in the region, like Colombia and Peru, which are the topic of this conversation. First, I would like to emphasize that Colombia made great strides in reducing poverty during the boom. Inequality also fell, although at a slower pace. Colombia had the fourth largest reduction in poverty rates in the 2000-2014 period. and around so poverty rates were reduced by around 19 percentage points, which was a very quick reduction in poverty rates. Extreme poverty also fell by about 8 percentage points, which was also very good. And there was a reduction of about 2 percentage points in income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. So those are the results that the paper emphasizes that are very remarkable in terms of how these commodity exporters managed to reduce both poverty and inequality. Now, labor income growth, particularly among high income, particularly among low income deciles, explains the bulk of these results. When you take a look at what happened to labor income, of course, labor income increased across all the distribution of the population, but especially did so among low-income deciles. And I agree to the extent with the channels that were identified by the authors. They mentioned that high commodity prices in the oil sector induce a boom in non-tradable sectors like construction and services, which raise the demand for unskilled labor and thus increase wages for poor households. And I think that's exactly the channel that went through during this commodity boom for the region, and particularly for Colombia. And this boom was further amplified by fiscal policy through higher investment in infrastructure, for example. So the royalties that national and subnational governments gained from this boom also were used in infrastructure investment and further amplified the gains for this economic boom. And this gave essentially, as you mentioned, Antoinette, stalled but not reversed after the oil price shock. So Colombia is an oil commodity exporter country. So the price shock in 2014 had a tremendous impact in its terms of trades. So economic growth fell from an average of 4.2% before the shock from 2000 to 2014 to about 2.4% after the shock. So then the unemployment rate started to climb. Before the shock, unemployment rate was below 10%. Then it started to climb a little bit above 10%. And this deteriorated labor growth, particularly again among low-income deciles. Fortunately, Colombia has a very well-established social safety net that covers about 50% of poor households, which I think partially mitigated the income losses among these poor families. So what happened during COVID-19? So we know that Colombia's output fell by 6.8% last year, which was a tremendous shock, of course. Unemployment rates also rose from 10.5% in 2019 to about 16% last year. And our own estimates from the Household Service imply that poverty increased by about 6.2 percentage points just last year, reaching about 42% of the population, and then reversing the gains observed in the past 8 years. So that's to give you a sense of the substantial shock in terms of economic growth and also the rise in poverty. Now, the policy response, I think, it was very useful. The existing social programs were reinforced. The government also created some other social programs that prevented poverty rates from rising by an additional 2 percentage points. For example, there was a solidarity income program that reached 3 million households in record time. And I think that was very good, for example, for preventing some vulnerable households from falling into poverty. And there was also a wage subsidy for 4 million workers, formal workers, that I think was also very instrumental in preventing further job losses and poverty increases. Now, to the final point of your question about the key challenges, I think that the first policy challenge for reducing poverty is removing the barriers for productivity and output growth. I think we know that economic growth, again, is one of the most important aspects for reducing poverty rates across the region and across the world. In a recent book that we published from Desarrollo, I, along with a co-author, identify several barriers that impede growth in Colombia, and I think most of these topics are essentially general in the region. And we identified the top 5 barriers to growth. And the first one is the low quality of institutions, especially related to the enforcement of contracts, the prevalence of corruption. If we can increase the quality of institutions, that would definitely increase productivity and output growth. The second was the absence of competition in key markets, which derives to a large extent from low exposure to international trade. The region, especially Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina, are very closed economies, and that is a deterrent for further competition in local private markets. The third item was labor informality that extends to 60% of the labor force, and that has been identified as an important deterrent for output and productivity growth. The fourth element was low levels and low growth of public investment. Closing the gap of infrastructure, it's very key for raising growth. And finally, the low levels of investment in innovation and research and development are key. But I think this is not enough for reducing inequality. I mean, there's a strong relationship between economic growth and reductions in poverty. But even in countries that have growth at very fast rates have not been able to reduce inequality as much. So I think the second challenge is increasing the progressivity of fiscal policy. So fiscal policy changes very little income distribution before and after tax and transfers due to first, a tax system with low levels of personal income taxation and very limited progressivity. And second, the existence of some transfers and subsidies that are particularly regressive. In Colombia, for example, we have the pension system where about 54% of pension subsidies are reaching the top quintile, and just 5% are reaching the 20% that are the poorer households in the country. So I think to round up my introduction, sustaining poverty and income inequality reductions will require structural reforms that increase the progressivity and efficiency of fiscal policy and remove the barriers to productivity and economic growth. Thank you very much, Antoinette.
And thank you so much, Luis Fernando. Very helpful. And of course, issues on the productivity side and facilitating accompanying that clearly by structural policies to increase the progressivity of fiscal policy. A very important point. That focusing a lot on learning from, of course, what has transpired with countries through the crisis, and very important at the same time for issues around poverty and inequality, and making the fiscal space necessary to facilitate those higher quality investments that are also essential to supporting more robust growth. Quite a bit there we can talk a bit more about, and maybe a way to turn then to looking ahead and to asking, what policymakers in the region should be doing. And you started us underscoring some of the issues that need to be looked at. And I wanted to bring in Alejandro to maybe take that a bit further, maybe to start by asking him whether, in fact, we're seeing higher commodity prices now, and for countries like Colombia, of course, opportunities to channel the impact of those higher prices on better revenues and into again facilitating more reduction in poverty and improvements in inequality. Alejandro, what is your perspective on whether Latin America and the commodity boom it's not a boom yet, but potentially is able to help Latin America once again on the poverty front, and where the importance of structural reforms sits in relation to being able to do that. So Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Antoinette. And obviously, I mean, an international environment of high commodity prices, low interest rate, etc., will help Latin America. But I mean, obviously, Latin America cannot only hope and base its development policies on good external factors because they will not be enough, because they are volatile and uncertain, and because, as it has been said before, policy making in Latin America has to become both in the macro and on the micro much better at setting the incentives for investment, productivity, job creation, and on the redistribute side, to induce a much larger redistribution effect coming from economic policy directly through public finances, indirectly through, let's call it antitrust regulation, or at least moving the structure of our economy to one that is much more competitive, that will significantly reduce prices of the consumption basket that is consumed in a higher percentage by the poor. There's some estimates that the distribution effect of moving towards a better, a more competitive environment in some key sectors, for example, in Mexico, can provide positive effects on income distribution and poverty, similar to the one that some of the conditional cash transfer programs generate. So there's a lot of space also in doing good micro policy to really induce a better income distribution, increase wages at the lower end of the wage distribution, etc. So definitely the answer is no. Even at the end of the commodity boom, I mean, in the last commodity boom, we had a very long period of high commodity prices, but also ever increasing commodity prices. So even at the end of the cycle, we were seeing when commodity prices were stabilizing at very high levels, that the effects on growth and other important macro variables were starting to slow down. So Latin America not only needed high commodity prices, but ever increasing commodity prices to maintain the trend. How are we coming out of the COVID pandemic? Latin America, we have had the deepest recession in 2020 and one of the slowest recoveries and one of the largest scarring, together with other emerging markets, as the WIO has highlighted. Advanced economies will return to pre-pandemic income per capita in the years ahead, while emerging markets and low-income countries will not be able to come back to pre-pandemic income per capita. Then when we look at distribution effects, obviously, even if the whole economy goes back to a relatively good level of GDP per capita and growth rates, what we're seeing and was commented before in the panel, I mean, women and low-skilled workers will continue to suffer. Youth will continue to suffer in terms of access to new jobs. And then this divergent recovery will also expand, let's say, in the dimension of formal versus informal services versus industrial production, high-tech sectors, etc. So I think there's a key policy issue there to continue to support and basically to rotate support to basically generate or to generate incentives for low-income wages in the following years. And as Nora has said, and we have stressed, I mean, remedial actions on the education front are key for the short term and for the medium term. Latin America is a region of the world that has had the largest average loss of in-person schooling around the world. And the heterogeneity of that between access of high-income family kids to schooling, to online learning, etc., versus low-income household kids is huge. So it's a matter of productivity for the future. It's a matter for income distribution and social justice as well. And it's important to highlight one important result of the report, that a lot of the benefits of the commodity cycle for income distribution or for poverty came from the creation of low income jobs in the service sector and the increasing wages in this sector. And that is the sector that will be hampered through the pandemic as well. So we have to help that channel of distribution. Just in closing, I think our policy recommendation for many countries is very similar to what Luis Fernando mentioned. On the fiscal side, we need to continue to support the economy, maybe with rotation to more focus and support specific to the sectors that I just mentioned, but also anchor the medium-term sustainability by reforms that guarantee that the country will go back to sustainable policies, both from the fiscal debt side, but also from the social side. Latin America will need more risk sharing among its population, more public goods on education and health. And obviously, it will need growth. And for that, structural reforms to really tackle the long-lasting problem of low productivity in Latin America, it's key. And one venue to do that, obviously, is jump-starting a green recovery through investment in climate change, adaptation, mitigation, etc. So I will close with that. Thanks, Antoinette.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Quite an agenda for the region. I mean, to work to undo some of the damage from the crisis. At the same time, taking opportunities, of course, deepening on the structural reform front, and taking opportunities for the future in moving into greener investments, and certainly undoing the damage to sectors that had accommodated the increase in incomes for low-income workers in the past, and have been clearly devastated by the crisis. Quite a bit to take forward, but it's an opportunity to bring in, I think, Luis Fernando again, and to talk about the issues of around improving social outcomes in a sustainable way. I mean, there's a balance, of course, to be struck in light of the macro constraints and fiscal space constraints that some countries have, and the debt issues that some will be facing, and how and when to rein back in support that could facilitate improvement in social outcomes. How to calibrate it is probably a better way to put it. But why don't you speak a bit to what policies you think would countries in the region need to do to have improved social outcomes be sustainable?
Well, thank you very much, Antoinette. And those policies are related to what I discussed before, the barriers to economic growth, productivity, and a more progressive tax system, and related to some of the issues that Alejandro mentioned as well. First, I think that it's very important to increase exposure to trade, while at the same time diversifying exportable goods to depend less and less on these particular commodity exports. And this will require a reduction of existing trade as well as non-trade barriers, and the design of productive development policies aimed at solving market or government failures that prevent domestic firms from participating in global value chains, which is something that Latin America has not been successfully able to do, or even at a more basic level, taking advantage of free trade agreements. Colombia, Peru, and other countries in the region have signed many free trade agreements, but the opportunity for using those free trade agreements is still there. So diversifying, increasing exposure to trade, I think it's key. Second, I think there's a need to start building consensus for the discussion of fiscal reforms that increase tax bases, especially for personal income, which still the region collects a small amount in terms of personal income taxation, that also eliminate exemptions, deductions, and preferential treatments, and combat evasion through better tax administration. I think that's key. And of course, at the same time, if you do these by also strengthening social safety nets through increased coverage and maybe higher transfers, you could be in the good path of building consensus for reform. And I think Colombia, for example, has just recently presented a very ambitious tax and social reform, which is in line with very, very much of these elements, but unfortunately has very limited political space due to a presidential and congressional elections that are coming next year. So it's important to build a consensus, to identify the problems that the paper also mentions, and the idea of increasing tax bases and having a more progressive tax system, I think is very important. And in this regard, I think green taxes are an especially good idea. I mean, they provide the right signals from a public policy perspective, in the sense that private agents start to internalize the costs their behavior imposes on society and the environment as well. And they also have very high legitimacy in the region. So green taxes, I think there's a room to be explored higher taxes across the region for not only as a signal from public policy, but also as a source of revenues in the short term. Now, tax reforms will not only stabilize public finances, but will also permit higher public infrastructure investment, which I think is another important issue that I mentioned before. And infrastructure investment is necessary not only for the short term as a counter-cyclical tool, but also in the long term for raising productivity growth. So I think that's also key. Now, third, I think that it's important that the region revises and adjusts accordingly social contracts. And Alejandro mentioned this before. The extent of risk sharing that is going on in the region, I think, is not well enough. And there are certain exclusions that continue to be pervasive in Latin America. And these exclusions greatly limit opportunities for social mobility, for economic growth. And I think there are three aspects of social contracts that merit special attention in the fallout of this pandemic. And these are first, the access to labor, to formal labor markets. And second, the access to pensions, which are essentially two sides of the same coin. If you solve the labor part of the formal part of labor markets, you probably will solve coverage of the pension system. And third, as Alejandro mentioned as well, access to high quality education. So let me comment a little bit on each of these. So first, Latin America has segmented dual markets, labor markets, with a very high incidence of informality of about 60% on average. So most workers are excluded from formal jobs. Informal workers bear the risk of unemployment and the risk of no income after retirement, since by definition they do not contribute to pensions. So reducing non-wage labor costs has been a particularly useful instrument for increasing formality. In Colombia, for example, implemented in 2012 a labor tax reform that did just that and had an important effect in increasing formality. But maybe more is needed. And I think, for example, financing health through flat taxes on wages, as is the case in Colombia, is a bad idea. Universal coverage implies that workers can stay informal and still access health services. So why don't think about migrating towards a model that instead of financing health through income taxes on wages, to taxes on wages, finances these through income taxes, or at least to a model where you have progressivity on these taxes on wages, starting, for example, at 0% at the minimum wage. I think that goes a long way into reducing these incentives for informal workers as staying in the informal jobs. High informality rates also imply low coverage in the pension systems. I think parametric reforms are necessary, but not sufficient. While the informality problem is solved, it is necessary to increase the coverage of non-contributory schemes. I think that's key. In Colombia, just about a quarter of adults over 65 have access to a pension, mainly highly educated formal workers. So again, we are talking about exclusion. So I think non-contributory schemes are highly progressive and could eliminate the risk of poverty for these elderly people. And finally, in education, years of schooling have increased throughout the region, although they remain below those observed in Asian countries. There are still important gaps. If you take a look at the difference between the top decile and the bottom decile of the income distribution, the difference in average years of education is about 5 years. So this is an important barrier for social mobility. And quality adjusted years are much lower. For example, Colombia has an average of 8.3 years of education compared to Japan's around 13 years. But quality adjusted numbers in Colombia is just 6.1 years. So that's another important thing to tackle, not only the coverage of education, but also the quality of education. So I think, Antoinette, the COVID-19 crisis has brought to the surface the structural weaknesses in the region, but it also has opened up the opportunity for ambitious reforms. So, and the success of these reforms would definitely hinge crucially on building careful consensus and also on the appropriate sequencing of such reforms. The opportunities are there. Hopefully the region will move towards implementing these structural reforms. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Luis Fernandos. And isn't it the case that every crisis is indeed an opportunity and a lot to take forward, but real significant opportunities to exploit issues that were not seen as promising before, but certainly lessons from the crisis underscored the need to pay more attention to them and to grab at opportunities for green taxation, for example, to facilitate greener investments and then job opportunities there as well. And I think you and Alejandro, many areas of convergence and consensus on the important structural issues in particular that need to be addressed. And one of the issues that you've underscored in your intervention now that I want to come back to when we turn to Silvana will be this issue of how to actually get to the point where it's possible with the political consensus and to actually move forward with some of these very difficult issues as well. And how to build that political consensus, I think, is a challenge across the board for most countries, I would think, in the region also. But first to Nora and to, I know you've thought deeply about these issues around progressive taxation and some of the other issues that Luis Fernando mentioned as well on the education front also. And I'm just wondering whether you agree with the views you've heard both Alejandro and Luis Fernando point out, and whether there are additional issues that countries need to take on to resume the path towards eradication of poverty, short and medium term issues and challenges that will be with us for some time. Why don't you give us your perspective, Nora, looking forward?
Thank you, Antoinette. Yeah, I mean, it'd be kind of hard to comment on every aspect that was raised, but broadly, I think there's many issues that need to be discussed further in terms of what model to pursue in terms of the tax and spending and social protection in the region. But I want to take the opportunity again to emphasize the fact that Latin America is heterogeneous. We have spoken of commodity exporters, but we have commodity importers. And actually, the countries that are the poorest in the region are commodity importers in Central America, for example. So I think we need to have a different view for those that are not being benefited by the international environment as a result of higher commodity prices. Second thing is that we have countries that are very heterogeneous in terms of the size of the state. So in the case of Argentina and Brazil, you cannot say you have to raise taxes because they're already the size almost of Nordic countries in the OECD, pushing close to 40% of GDP. So you already are there. You probably have to go in the other direction. The other extreme, you have Guatemala that raises about 14% of GDP, where we know that the problem there is that you need to raise more, and then you have a lot of things in between. So I think thirdly, also think that the macro challenges, and since we also wanted to have a sort of an engagement, a dialogue here, I think be interesting to hear Alejandro, Luis Fernando, and Silvana comment on this. The challenges are different also in terms of debt sustainability for the region. I think there are countries that are going to face tough situations and others which may breeze through should anything change in the international environment, like, for example, if interest rates eventually start growing in the US, as we know, for Latin America, that'll be a punch in the nose. Yeah. And I wonder how, what's the IMF's view in terms of how to deal with those dangers and how far away do you see them? Now, coming back to the specific policies, I think there are three things that concern me the most. One, I think that we've learned that the digital divide has to be closed and closed as fast as possible because it permeates many of the inequities that go from access to education, access to remote work, access to transfers that can be collected without exposing yourself to health risks, or do it as quickly as possible. So that's an area where I think the both productivity impact and inclusiveness impact could be very promising. So it's an area where, probably was not looked at it so keenly before, and now the pandemic has actually raised it to the forefront. The second one is education. As the work we've done. I mean, Alejandro mentioned that the reason why inequality declined to a large extent is because wages at the bottom increased as a result of higher demand. But it also happened that due to the expansion of education in the 1990s, you had a change in the composition of the workforce by levels of education, making workers with lower skill relatively scarce compared to workers with higher skills. That lied at the bottom of the declining inequality story in Latin America throughout. So, with the pandemic and its impact on education, what I fear the most is a reversal of that process, where again in the future, workers with lower educational levels will become relatively more abundant. That will put pressure, lower, the pressure and their wages, increase the downward pressure on their wages, which combined with changes in technology that we're witnessing even from before the pandemic could exacerbate inequality in labor earnings. So the educational story again plays a crucial role here. And the third thing that I want to point out, move that sort of concerns me a lot, has to do with what's going to happen in the landing process. The IMF has rightly, and now Alejandro has emphasized, asked countries to implement countercyclical policies to fend off the pandemic and to continue supporting it through the process of recovery. But we know that at some point, the accumulated debt and fiscal deficits will have to be reined in. So, what's the strategy there? We have to be very careful because if we have to rely on increases in taxes, usually the taxes that are raised are the ones that are on consumption. And what we know is that consumption taxes can hurt the poor. So you may, even if you introduce progressivity in your tax system, progressive taxes can be poverty increasing if the poor pay them, okay? Even if they decrease inequality. So in the strategy of how countries will face the landing from this process, it's very important what the role of taxes will be. And on the spending side, which sectors will be protected the most? For example, education clearly is one that will need to be protected from cuts, health, social protection. But then, you want to invest in infrastructure for growth. There'll be very tough choices. And I think we need to have a clear sense of within those tough choices, what choices have to be made in order to protect the poor, in order to reduce inequality in the longer term, and at the same time, stimulate growth. So let me stop here.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there will be a lot of agreement with that latter point, needing a clear view on which sectors, of course, are most important in terms of safeguarding the past progress and averting further deterioration in the situation of the poor, and the difficult choices will need to be made. I mean, I think on the revenue side, of course, there are significant opportunities in some countries, of course, to raise more revenue simply from reducing exemptions and other things that don't necessarily imply a negative impact on the poor, if they can take those opportunities to reinforce, tax administrations and reduce exemptions. Some room for creating more fiscal space with those sorts of things. But we'll come back actually to Alejandro in a minute or in a few minutes to talk about some of those issues. I wanted to ask though Silvana to come in at this stage to. You see the huge agenda, of course, that the region needs to take forward, multi-dimensional, complex, politically taxing, very difficult to get consensus around. How do you do that? How do you build a political consensus? I mean, in your experience as a policy maker, an active policy maker, what does it take to get agreement on these very difficult trade-offs also that need to be made?
Thank you, Antoinette. I would say that the building political willingness and commitment. I guess that's the first condition. I guess all of the colleagues have in some way pointed out that aspect. We could have very technical and very rigorous research. However, if we don't really have political willingness, we are not really going to move any way forward. I do agree that if taken wisely, crises can actually become into opportunities. They can turn out into opportunities. But actually, pandemia has also shown us, has actually slapped our faces and showed that actually structural inequalities have not really been tackled in Latin America. And another lesson I would drive forward is that even if commodity prices actually become again an opportunity, they don't guarantee alone economic growth. And economic growth alone does not guarantee a sustainable poverty reduction policy or path. In that way, from what everyone has suggested in the panel, I would say that in some way or the other, we do know that we need to combine a number of aspects. I would say we have the employment creation and promotion, we have social protection, actually a boost of social protection measures, we have a service improvement decision dealing particularly with education and health, we have investment in infrastructure, that's a tough one, and also, and most importantly, I would say governance. We won't go any further as long as we actually work towards governance. And what is actually governance about? Governance is actually about how we make decisions, the best possible decisions, under the most adverse circumstances, based upon a collective approach and being able to define what are the priorities, what are the strategies, and what are the responsibilities or the institutional arrangements. In that sense, I would say that in terms of priorities, we have learned in Peru that these huge inequalities we face, we have reassured in that sense that human well-being, again, is multidimensional in nature. We need social protection, we need employment, we need investment, but we don't need either or, we need all of them. In that way, result-based policies are a platform actually to align all these sectoral policies are not really coordinating as much as we would like, but we are moving towards a same goal. I would say also that this means that as policymakers, this is very important, we do not, should not, must not have to choose between health or economics. Well-being is multidimensional and requires both, and requires most of these actions. In terms of the strategies, I would like to stress three of them. First of all, information systems. By reinforcing the importance of national household registries for timely and accurate decision-making. This could help us targeting system-related efforts in terms of social protection, service provision, investment. In second place, we have multi-actor collaboration. We have learned to collaborate with the private sector, with the social, with the civil society, moving along towards common goals. And third, and this is very important, committed applied research. We need to start posing new questions because the reality we're facing now is no longer the reality we used to know 11 or 12 or 13 months ago. It's no longer there. So we need to start posing new questions to produce new or renewed knowledge as long as we need to make decisions. Finally, I would say that we have some institutional arrangements that we need to revise as well. We cannot keep acting the way we used to. So that's very difficult because that means we need to go beyond the line and try to propose a new way to start doing things we were so convinced we knew how to do. So in that way, I think we need to define the roles again, the redefinition of roles. And in the case of Peru, as I was saying, we have the role of regional and local governments. We do not operate from the national government alone. We need to base our decisions on a territorial approach that actually takes into account the diverse dynamics that are going out in the territory. And this is, and as Nora is saying, it's not the same Mexico as Peru or Chile or Colombia. But even within Peru, it's not the same Tumbes or Loreto or Lima. They are not the same. So we need to make sure that each of these governments includes their experience and deals with these issues, working towards what we have called territorial agendas, making sure to set up priorities, define the strategies, and make sure that roles are clearly defined. I will stop there, Antoinette. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Silvana, for that. It really helps to deepen our perspective and drilling into the country by country diversity there is, and within countries, the local diversity and issues there with different provinces or different regions and local governments and what they have to take on, and it requires a much more focused lens that really values deep understanding of the political economy context as well, and to situate, of course, policy advice in that context. A lot to think through, and it's a way of maybe combining some of the issues Nora raised and wanted Alejandro's sort of comment on as well, to talk a bit more and to give Alejandro a minute or two, and I'm going to turn to each of you to try to get some concluding remarks now, as we unfortunately look like we're going to run out of time in 10 minutes with our very stimulating conversation. But Alejandro, to speak to the issues of trade-offs that Nora was flagging in terms of the concerns some countries will have, and the need a number of countries will have to address debt sustainability issues, and to start to scale back some of their support that they're doing, and what considerations should be there in doing so, and maybe combining that to talk a bit more about how the funds work with in support of country authorities is evolving in light of the crisis, and what sorts of advice are we giving on those trade-offs that countries should take, at the same time trying to make sure they deal with the impact of policies on poverty and inequality. So an opportunity for you to try to get us to, I think Nora was very kind in underscoring the evolution that she sees in the IMF's approach and presence in this domain of really thinking through inequality and poverty. I think it certainly predates the crisis, but clearly with the inheritance of the crisis, that is indeed a key focus of our work going forward. And Alejandro will say a little bit about perhaps how we're doing that both in countries with programs and with our surveillance work. All of that in 2 minutes.
Thanks, Antoinette. And I think what Nora put forward is the key macro and fiscal trade-off for countries. On the one hand, from a cyclical perspective, from a support of the most affected perspective, there is an optimal fiscal policy. On the other hand, your debt sustainability can be questioned after the increase in debt to GDP ratios going forward, and then the increase on your financing requirements for the next couple of years are how you're going to achieve them are put in doubt. And in that sense, what we have said is that, I mean, a couple of percentage points of GDP of a higher deficit this year should not be the key issue determining medium-term debt sustainability if you're able to anchor the medium-term credibility of your fiscal policy. People know what you're going to do once the pandemic is over to bring back your public finances to a sustainable position. However, given the uncertainty, given the political economy, given institutional weaknesses, once you don't have that, and if you cannot achieve that politically, then you need to front load your fiscal adjustment to send a signal to markets that you're coming back to normality sooner than what is warranted, but to guarantee that you have access to markets. How do you break that? The first thing is to try to do now some reforms on your fiscal side that guarantee that in the future you're going to go back. And it's legislated and it's approved. That's one. Also in the middle, I think, and you mentioned what is the role of the international organizations and the IMF, is to support this policy design that basically backloads the adjustment and front load the support. And that's why we exist. And at this point, I mean, we are in the situation in which we are arguing maybe for fiscal policies that are looser than what countries feel compelled to implement because of market vulnerabilities. So we don't have, let's say, the traditional perception that the IMF is asking for a fiscal policy that is tighter than what the government wants to run. Actually, in this economic cycle, we would be an instrument to implement a fiscal policy that actually allows the government to go beyond what it feels compelled to do, given what the markets or market uncertainty is imposing on them. So that's a little bit how we have been framing that discussion. And obviously, on the specifics on taxes versus expenditures, Nora, I mean, laid out the heterogeneity in the region, and obviously that's a very country-specific discussions that our teams are having. Thanks, Antoinette.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. So with that, to turn to Luis Fernando and to maybe get your closing thoughts as well on some of these issues and how we square the circle in these trade-offs as well that are there, and any comments you'd like to make on what the fund should be doing to help would be most appreciated.
Wonderful, Antoinette. Thank you very much. So first, I would like to comment a little bit on what Nora mentioned about raising consumption taxes. I mean, what matters is not whether consumption taxes are regressive. What matters is what fiscal policy ends up doing with the revenues raised from consumption taxes. So, I mean, in Colombia, for example, we started doing last year a compensation on VAT expenditure for low-income households, which I think opens up the possibility of raising consumption taxes without having the regressivity part on it. So I think that's key, for example, for advancing in terms of raising taxes. But I completely agree, Antoinette, with what Alejandro mentioned. I think the political space is limited, which implies that you have to front load all the aspect related to support, wage subsidies, social transfer nets, but give a credible signal to investors about how you're going to, in a gradual way, phasing in this type of tax raises, how are you going to adjust your fiscal position? I mean, it doesn't have to be done immediately, but if you give this credible signal to markets, I think that goes a long way into having this sustainable recovery of both public finances and the support to households that are, particularly vulnerable during this transition.
Thank you so much, Luis Fernando. Very insightful and succinct. Thank you very much for those closing thoughts. I'll turn to Nora next to say her last word on this very stimulating conversation, and any additional advice for the IMF's work as well.
Yeah, no, we have, I think, just a minute. So I think that I am so glad to hear whatever I've been hearing from the IMF. I cannot tell you how delighted I am. And I think that we're hearing, the academics that are doing work on these issues are here to help think through aspects that are based more on sort of longer term research or parallel research that the IMF is doing at the level of, deciding what to do in the future. I think it will be very important to look at the trade-offs and ensure that the scaling back of spending or raising taxes does not end up undoing even more what the pandemic undid with its own shock. So since the IMF focuses on budgets, I think that is very important to bear in mind, not just levels, but the composition and who's going to be benefiting and hurt by the policies moving forward when the time comes to rein in what's happened during the counter-cyclical policy.
my. I'm so sorry. It looks like we just lost Nora with the connection somehow giving away. But I think she was at the end of her intervention. Hopefully, she's able to join us quickly back. But let's see if the minister has the last word she wants to uh, put in. Silvana, before our meeting to a close.
Thank you. The alignment shared with Nora about this commitment the IMF is showing towards discussing poverty and inequality and exploring new venues to actually keep moving forward. I guess this is very, very important for countries in Latin America and worldwide. Actually, I would like to provide these closing remarks emphasizing that policies cannot be neutral, cannot be context-free. So that is why each of us is actually taking into account what our own countries are actually going through. In Peru, we are in the middle of an electoral process, very, very complex. And this is probably why we like to stress some particular issues. I would like to conclude with some AEIOU remarks to keep a little bit of good humor, actually, to boost the discussion. Alliances. We cannot move forward alone. We need to keep building alliances towards these common goals. I guess investment is good, social protection is good, employment creation is good, but we need to put into account this common ground that we need to keep building and strengthening. We need to move faster, promoting social legitimacy of our decisions. Engagement. The engagement deals with this committing all possible actors towards these goals. Engaging local and regional authorities, as I said, is not now a condition, it's not optional, it's something we must do. Otherwise, our policies are not going to sustain throughout time. Information. The pandemic has shown that we still have enormous gaps in terms of how we manage information, how we deal with data management, how we actually able to cover people in these systems. And again, it's very important to make timely and good decisions. And again, we need research to have new questions posed to people to actually get to better answers. And actually, as Nora is saying, ICTs are now here for good. We are not moving backwards. And so we need to start dealing with them in how we provide social protection. Outcomes. It's not only about complying targets, it's about promoting outcomes. Outcomes center around people's well-being. It's not about commodities. Commodities are a means to actually boost social protection, boost well-being. Universal recipes, universal solutions, universal policies are now being very far from being effective given the heterogeneity of all our countries. We said that. So under any circumstances, we should not allow COVID-19 to take away, to kidnap the agenda of what is being really important. And what is very important and will always be is to try to put people first. We will resist. We will do our best effort to do so. Many thanks.
Now, thank you so much, Silvana. A very impactful way of concluding with those with that acronym and explaining what they involve, and your comments and others from Nora also and from Luis Fernando just makes me want to say a word about the importance that the IMF attaches to partnerships. Because as you've all said, we are, of course, needing to infuse our macro advice with better knowledge of the interlinkages and a better knowledge of the inequality and poverty outcomes that evolve from certain strategies. And for that, of course, we need partnerships in terms of the nature of our knowledge, the depth of our knowledge on some of the sectoral issues, and some of the issues that our sister institution, the World Bank, knows better, of course, just underscores our continued work on strengthening that partnership, but partnership with others like Nora and others who are doing longer term research that we can learn from as well. So partnership is a key aspect of our ability to put our arms around some of these issues in a productive way. So last word, and I'm sorry, Nora, you were cut off when you were intervening. I hope you were at the end of your your comments. But if you want to say a last word, happy to. Or was that?
Fine. I just was emphasizing the fact that when the time comes to rein in the fiscal deficit, that
right.
attention is paid on how it's done to avoid hurting the poor in the process. That was my main message.
Indeed, indeed. And as Alejandro was trying to indicate, of course, the fund is suggesting that this is not the time to rein in everything, and that countries have an opportunity to calibrate how they deal with the fiscal challenges they have. And that's why the IMF is here, after all, because we give an opportunity for needed financing to smooth that adjustment as well. So those are some of the things we're very focused on these days. Last word from Luis Fernando. We're over time, but just your last word.
Well, Antoinette, I think I already made my final remarks. I'm glad about this paper and about the willingness from the IMF for supporting transition in these very, very challenging times. And I think what just Nora mentioned about the importance of thinking about how these policies affect the poor households, which have had especially hard times, is definitely key in terms of having a successful transition. So thank you very much, Antoinette, for this conversation. It's been delightful.
And thank you to you, Luis Fernando, and to all of our distinguished panelists for what has been, for me, a most stimulating and educational hour and 15 minutes. I'm still a relative newcomer to Latin America, but I'm learning quickly and have learned immensely from this conversation. And just to really thank you for valuable input you've given us, and to say that our analytic work, of course, is going to continue to deepen around issues of inequality and the impact of macro policies on poverty and inequality in the months ahead. And in the context of our individual surveillance and lending work, of course, a greater lens on those issues as well. That's what we're seeking to certainly help countries with. So with that, let me say thank you, wishing you the very best, and looking forward to deepening our partnerships in the months and years ahead. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.